Good morning, everybody. It's Miss Bell again. Today I'm going to read the next two chapters of The Witches. All right, let's get right into it. Miss Bell get her Starbucks. I made it at home. I did not leave my house. Stay inside. Speaking of staying inside, tomorrow I'm going to try to make a video about the coronavirus. So look for that. All right, let's get started. Chapter 3, How to Recognize a Witch. The next evening, after my grandmother had given me my bath, she took me once again into the living room for another story. Tonight, the old woman said, I am going to tell you how to recognize a witch when you see one. Can you always be sure? I asked. No, she said, you can't. And that's the trouble. But you can make a pretty good guess. She was dropping cigar ash all over her lap, and I hoped she wasn't going to catch on fire before she told me how to recognize a witch. In the first place, she said, a real witch is certain always to be wearing gloves when you meet her. Surely not always, I said. What about in the summer when it's hot? Even in the summer, my grandmother said. She has to. You want to know why? Why? I said. Because she doesn't have fingernails. Instead of fingernails, she has thin, curvy claws like a cat, and she wears the gloves to hide them. Mind you, lots of very respectable women wear gloves, especially in the winter, so this doesn't help you very much. Mama used to wear gloves, I said. Not in the house, my grandmother said. Witches wear gloves even in the house. They only take them off when they go to bed. How do you know all this, Grandmama? Don't interrupt, she said. Just take it all in. The second thing to remember is that a real witch is always bald. Bald, I said. Bald as a boiled egg, my grandmother said. I was shocked. There was something indecent about a bald woman. Why are they bald, Grandmama? Don't ask me why, she snapped, but you can take it from me that not a single hair grows on a witch's head. How horrid! Disgusting, my grandmother agreed. If she's bald, she'll be easy to spot, I said. Not at all, my grandmother said. A real witch always wears a wig to hide her baldness. She wears a first-class wig, and it is almost impossible to tell a really first-class wig from ordinary hair, unless you give it a pull to see if it comes off. Then that's what I'll have to do, I said. Don't be foolish, my grandmother said. You can't go around pulling at the hair of every lady you meet, even if she is wearing gloves. Just you try it and see what happens. So that doesn't help much either, I said. None of these things is any good on its own, my grandmother said. It's only when you put them all together that they begin to make a little sense. Mind you, my grandmother went on, these wigs do cause a rather serious problem for witches. What problem, Grandmama? They make the itch scalp terribly, she said. You see, when an actress wears a wig, or if you and I were to wear a wig, we would be putting it on over our own hair. But a witch has to put it straight on her naked scalp, and underneath of a wig, it is always very rough and scratchy. It sets up a frightful itch on the bald skin. It causes nasty sores on the head. Wig rash is what the witches call it, and it doesn't half itch. What other things must I look for to recognize a witch? I said. Look for the nose holes, my grandmother said. Witches have slightly larger nose holes than ordinary people. The rim of each nose hole is pink and curvy, like the rim of a certain kind of seashell. Why do they have such big nose holes? I asked. For smelling with, my grandmother said. A real witch has the most amazing powers of smell. She can actually smell a child who is standing on the other side of the street on a pitch-black night. She couldn't smell me, I said. I just had a bath. Oh, yes, she could, my grandmother said. The cleaner you happen to be, the more smelly you are to a witch. That can't be true, I said. An absolutely clean child gives off the most ghastly stench to a witch, my grandmother said. The dirtier you are, the less you smell. But that doesn't make sense, Grandmama. Oh, yes, it does, my grandmother said. It isn't the dirt that the witch is smelling, it is you. The smell that drives a witch mad actually comes right out of your own skin. It comes oozing out of your skin in waves, and these waves, stink waves, the witches call them, go floating through the air and hit the witch right smack in her nostrils. They send her reeling. Now, wait a minute, Grandmama. Don't interrupt, she said. The point is this. When you haven't washed for a week and your skin is all covered over with dirt, then quite obviously the stink waves cannot come oozing out nearly so strongly. I shall never have a bath again, I said. Just don't have one too often, my grandmother said. Once a month is quite enough for a sensible child. That's not true. Bathe every day. It was moments like these that I loved my grandmother more than ever. Grandmama, I said, if it's a dark night, how can a witch smell the difference between a child and a grown-up? Because grown-ups don't give out stink waves, she said. Only children do that. But I don't really give out stink waves, do I? I asked. I'm not giving them out at this very moment, am I? Not to me you aren't, my grandmother said. To me, you smell like raspberries and cream. But to a witch, you would be smelling absolutely disgusting. What would I be smelling of? I asked. Dog droppings, my grandmother said. I reeled. I was stunned. Dog droppings, I cried. I am not smelling of dog droppings. I don't believe it. I won't believe it. What's more, my grandmother said, speaking with a touch of relish, to a witch, you would be smelling of fresh dog droppings. That is simply not true, I cried. I know I am not smelling of dog droppings, stale or fresh. There's no point in arguing about it, my grandmother said. It's a fact of life. I was outraged. I simply couldn't bring myself to believe what my grandmother was telling me. So if you see a woman holding her nose as she passes you in the street, she went on, that woman could easily be a witch. I decided to change the subject. Tell me what else to look for in a witch, I said. The eyes, my grandmother said. Look carefully at the eyes. Because the eyes of a real witch are different from yours and mine. Look in the middle of each eye where there is normally a little black dot. That's called a pupil. If she is a witch, that black dot will keep changing color. And you will see fire and you will see ice dancing right in the very center of the colored dot. It will send shivers running all over your skin. My grandmother leant back in her chair and sucked away contentedly at her foul black cigar. I squatted on the floor, staring up at her, fascinated. She was not smiling. She looked deadly serious. Are there other things? I asked her. Of course there are other things, my grandmother said. You don't seem to understand that witches are not actually women at all. They look like women. They talk like women. and they are able to act like women. But in actual fact, they are totally different animals. They are demons in human shape. This is why they have claws and bald heads and weird noses and peculiar eyes, all of which they have to conceal as best as they can from the rest of the world. What else is different about them, Grandmama? The feet, she said. Witches never have toes. No toes, I cried. Then what do they have? They just have feet, my grandmother said. The feet have square ends with no toes on them at all. Does that make it difficult to walk? I asked. Not at all, my grandmother said, but it does give them a problem with their shoes. All ladies like to wear small, rather pointed shoes, but a witch, whose feet are very wide and square at the ends, has the most awful job squeezing her feet into those neat little pointed shoes. Why doesn't she wear wide, comfy shoes with square ends? I asked. She dare not, my grandmother said. Just as she hides her baldness with a wig, she must also hide her ugly witch feet by squeezing them into pretty shoes. Isn't that terribly uncomfortable? I said. Extremely uncomfortable, my grandmother said, but she has to put up with it. If she's wearing ordinary shoes, it won't help me to recognize her, will it, Grandmama? I'm afraid it won't, my grandmother said. You might possibly see her limping very slightly, but only if you were watching closely. Are those the only differences then, Grandmama? There's one more, my grandmother said. Just one more. What is it, Grandmama? Their spit is blue. Blue, I cried. Not blue. Their spit can't be blue. Blue as a blueberry, she said. You don't mean it, Grandmama. Nobody can have blue spit. Witches can, she said. Is it like ink? I asked. Exactly, she said. They even use it to write with. They use those old-fashioned pens that have nibs, and then they simply lick the nib. Can you notice the blue spit, Grandmama? If a witch was talking to me, would I be able to notice it? Only if you looked carefully, my grandmother said. If you looked very carefully, you would probably see a slight bluish tinge on her teeth, but it doesn't show much. It would if she spat, I said. Witches never spit, my grandmother said. They wouldn't dare. I couldn't believe my grandmother would be lying to me. She went to church every morning of the week, and she said grace before every meal. And somebody who did that would never tell lies. I was beginning to believe every word she spoke. So there you are, my grandmother said. That's all I can tell you. None of it is very helpful. You can still never be absolutely sure whether a woman is a witch or not just by looking at her. But if she is wearing the gloves, if she has large nose holes, the weird eyes, and the hair that looks like it might be a wig, and if she has a bluish tinge on her teeth, if she has all these things, then you run like mad. Grandmama, I said, when you were a little girl, did you ever meet a witch? Once, my grandmother said. Only once. What happened? I'm not going to tell you, she said. It would frighten you out of your skin and give you bad dreams. Please tell me, I begged. No, she said. Certain things are too horrible to talk about. Does it have something to do with your missing thumb? I asked. Suddenly, her old wrinkled lips shut tight as a pair of tongs, and the hand that held the cigar, which had no thumb on it, began to quiver very slightly. I waited. She didn't look at me. She didn't speak. All of a sudden, she had shut herself off completely. The conversation was finished. "Good night, Grandmama," I said, rising from the floor and kissing her on the cheek. She didn't move. I crept out of the room and went to my bedroom. All right, we got one more chapter left. All right, Chapter 4, The Grand High Witch. The next day, a man in a black suit arrived at the house carrying a briefcase, and he held a long conversation with my grandmother in the living room. I was not allowed in while he was there, but when at last he went away, my grandmother came in to me, walking very slowly and looking very sad. "That man was reading me your father's will," she said. "What is a will?" I asked her. "It is something you write before you die," she said, "and in it you say who is going to have your money and your property. But most important of all, it says who is going to look after your child if both the mother and father are dead." A fearful panic took hold of me. "Did it say you, Grandmama?" I cried. "I don't have to go to somebody else, do I?" "No," she said. "Your father would never have done that. He has asked me to take care of you for as long as I live. But he has also asked that I take you back to your own house in England. He wants us to stay there." "But why?" I said. "Why can't we stay here in Norway? You would hate to live anywhere else. You told me you would." "I know," she said, "but there are a lot of complications with money and with the house that you wouldn't understand. Also, it said that in the will that although all your family is Norwegian, you were born in England and you have started your education there, and your father wants you to continue going to English schools." "Oh, Grandmama," I cried, "you don't want to go and live in our English house. I know you don't." "Of course I don't," she said, "but I'm afraid I must. The will said that your mother felt the same way about it, and it is important to respect the wishes of your parents." There was no way out of it. We had to go to England, and my grandmother started making arrangements at once. "Your next school term begins in a few days," she said, "so we don't have any time to waste." On the evening before we left for England, my grandmother got on her favorite subject once again. "There are not as many witches in England as there are in Norway," she said. "I'm sure I won't meet one," I said. "I sincerely hope you don't," she said, "because those English witches are probably the most vicious in the whole world." As she sat there smoking her foul cigar and talking away, I kept looking at the hand with the missing thumb. I couldn't help it. I was fascinated by it, and I kept wondering what awful things had happened at the time that she met a witch. It must have been something absolutely appalling and gruesome. Otherwise, she would have told me about it. Maybe the thumb had been twisted off, or perhaps she had been forced to jam her thumb down the spout of a boiling kettle until it steamed away. Or did someone pull it out of her hand like a tooth? I couldn't help trying to guess. "Tell me what those English witches do, Grandmama," I said. "Well," she said, sucking away her stinky cigar, "their favorite ruse is to mix up a powder that will turn a child into some creature or other that all grown-ups hate." "What sort of creature, Grandmama?" "Often it's a slug," she said. "A slug is one of their favorites. Then the grown-ups step up on the slug and squish it without knowing it's a child." "That's perfectly beastly," I cried. "Or it might be a flea," my grandmother said. "They might turn you into a flea, and without realizing what she was doing, your own mother would get out the flea powder, and then it's goodbye you." "You're making me nervous, Grandmama," I said. "I don't think I want to go back to England." I've known English witches, she went on, who have turned children into pheasants and then sneaked the pheasants up into the woods the very next day before the pheasant shooting season opened. Ouch, I said. So they get shot? Of course they get shot, she said, and then they get plucked and roasted and eaten for supper. I pictured myself as a pheasant, flying frantically over the men with the guns, swerving and dipping as the guns exploded below me. Yes, my grandmother said, it gives the English witches great pleasure to stand back and watch the grown-ups doing away with their own children. I really don't want to go to England, Grandmama. Of course you don't, she said. Nor do I, but I'm afraid we've got to. Are witches different in every country? I asked. Completely different, my grandmother said. But I don't know much about the other countries. Don't you even know about America? I asked. Not really, she answered, although I have heard it said that over there, the witches are able to make the grown-ups eat their own children. Never, I cried. Oh no, Grandmama, that couldn't be true. I don't know whether it's true or not, she said. It's only a rumor I've heard. But how could they possibly make them eat their own children? I asked. By turning them into hot dogs, she said. That wouldn't be too difficult for a clever witch. Does every single country in the world have its witches? I asked. Wherever you find people, you find witches, my grandmother said. There is a secret society of witches in every country. And do they all know one another, Grandmama? They do not, she said. A witch only knows the witches in her own country. She is strictly forbidden to communicate with a foreign witch. But an English witch, for example, will know all the other witches in England. They are all friends. They ring each other up. They swap deadly recipes. Goodness knows what else they think, or what else they talk about. I hate to think. I sat on the floor watching my grandmother. She put her cigar stub in the ashtray and folded her hands across her stomach. Once a year, she went on, the witches of each separate country hold their own secret meeting. They all get together in one place to receive a lecture from the Grand High Witch of all the world. From who? I cried. She is the ruler of them all, my grandmother said. She is all-powerful. She is without mercy. All other witches are petrified of her. They see her only once a year at their annual meeting. She goes there to whip up excitement and enthusiasm and to give orders. The Grand High Witch travels from country to country, attending those annual meetings. Where do they have these meetings, Grandmama? There are all sorts of rumors, my grandmother answered. I have heard it said that they just book into a hotel, like any other group of women who are holding a meeting. I have also heard it said that some very peculiar things go on in the hotels they stay in. It is rumored that the beds are never slept in, that there are burn marks on the bedroom carpets, that toads are discovered in the bathtubs, and that down in the kitchen, the cook once found a baby crocodile swimming in his saucepan of soup. My grandmother picked up her cigar and took another puff, inhaling the foul smoke deeply into her lungs. Where does the Grand High Witch live when she's at home? I asked. Nobody knows, my grandmother said. If we knew that, then she could be rooted out and destroyed. Witchophiles all over the world have spent their lives trying to discover the secret headquarters of the Grand High Witch. What is a witchophile, Grandmama? A person who studies witches and knows a lot about them, my grandmother said. Are you a witchophile, Grandmama? I'm a retired witchophile, she said. I am too old to be active any longer. But when I was younger, I traveled all over the globe trying to track down the Grand High Witch. I never even came close to succeeding." "Is she rich?" I asked. "She's rolling," my grandmother said, "simply rolling in money. Rumor has it that there is a machine in her headquarters, which is exactly like the machine the government uses to print the banknotes that you and I use. After all, banknotes are only bits of paper with special designs and pictures on them. Anyone can make them who has the right machine and the right paper. My guess is that the Grand High Witch makes all the money she wants, and she dishes it out to witches everywhere." "What about foreign money?" I asked. "Those machines can make Chinese money if you want them to," my grandmother said. "It's only a question of pressing the right button." "But Grandmama," I said, "if nobody has ever seen the Grand High Witch, how can you be so sure she exists?" My grandmother gave me a long and very severe look. "Nobody has ever seen the devil," she said, "but we know he exists." The next morning we sailed for England, and soon I was back in the old family home in Kent, but this time with only my grandmother to look after me. Then the Easter term began, and every weekday I went to school, and everything seemed to have come back to normal again. Now, at the bottom of our garden, there was an enormous conker tree, and high up in its branches, Timmy, my best friend, and I had started to build a magnificent tree house. We were able to work on it only at the weekends, but we were getting along fine. We had begun with the floor, which we built by laying wide planks between two quite far apart branches and nailing them down. Within a month, we had finished the floor. Then we constructed a wooden railing around the floor, and that left just the roof to be built. The roof was the difficult bit. One Sunday afternoon, when Timmy was in the bed with his flu, I decided to make a start on the roof all by myself. It was a lovely It was lovely being high up there in that conker tree, all alone with the pale young leaves coming out everywhere around me. It was like being in a big green cave, and the height made it extra exciting. My grandmother had told me that if I fell, I would break my leg, and every time I looked down, I got a tingle along my spine. I worked away, nailing the first plank on the roof. Then suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I caught sight of a woman standing immediately below me. She was looking up at me and smiling in the most peculiar way. When most people smile, their lips go out sideways. This woman's lips went upwards and downwards, showing all her front teeth and gums. Her gums were like raw meat. It is always a shock to discover that you're being watched when you think you're alone. And what was this strange woman doing in our garden anyway? I noticed that she was wearing a small black hat, and she had black gloves on her hands, and the gloves came up nearly to her elbows. Gloves! She was wearing gloves! I froze all over. "I have a present for you," she said, still staring at me, still smiling, still showing her teeth and gums. I didn't answer. "Come down out of that tree, little boy," she said, "and I shall give you the most exciting present you've ever had." Her voice had a curious rasping quality. It made a sort of metallic sound, as though her throat was full of drawing pins. Without taking her eyes from my face, she very slowly put one of those gloved hands into her purse and drew out a small green snake. She held it up for me to see. "It's tame," she said. Here's the bottom. The snake began to coil itself around her forearm. It was a brilliant green. "If you come down here, I shall give him to you," she said. "Oh, Grandmama," I thought, "come and help me." Then I panicked. I dropped the hammer and shot up that enormous tree like a monkey. I didn't stop until I was high as I could possibly go, and there I stayed, quivering with fear. I couldn't see the woman now. There were layers and layers of leaves between her and me. I stayed up there for hours, and I kept very still. It began to grow dark. At last, I heard my grandmother calling my name. "I'm up here," I shouted back. "Come down at once," she called. "It's past your supper time." "Grandmama," I shouted, "has that woman gone?" "What woman?" my grandmother called back. "The woman in the black gloves." There was silence from below. It was the silence of somebody who was too stunned to speak. "Grandmama," I shouted again, "has she gone?" "Yes," my grandmother answered at last. "She's gone. I'm here, my darling. I'll look after you. You can come down now." I climbed down. I was trembling. My grandmother enfolded me in her arms. "I've seen a witch," I said. "Come inside," she said. "You'll be all right with me." She led me into the house and gave me a cup of hot cocoa with lots of sugar in it. "Tell me everything," she said. I told her. By the time I had finished, it was my grandmother who was trembling. Her face was ashy gray, and I saw her glance down at that hand of hers that didn't have a thumb. "You know what this means," she said. "That means that there is one of them in our district. From now on, I'm not letting you walk alone to school." "Do you think she could be after me specially?" I asked. "No," she said, "I doubt that. One child is as good as any other to those creatures." It is hardly surprising that after that, I became a very witch-conscious little boy. If I happened to be alone on the road and I saw a woman approaching who was wearing gloves, I would quickly skip across to the other side. And as the weather remained pretty cold during the whole of that month, nearly everybody was wearing gloves. Curiously enough, though, I never saw the woman with the green snake again. That was my first witch, but it wasn't my last. All right, we're going to stop there for today. Tomorrow we will read chapters 5 and 6. So, I hope you guys are doing your work. I hope you guys are being healthy and safe. Don't forget that Miss Bell loves you, and I hope to see you soon. Bye, guys.